The Fall of the House of Usher. It was a dull, dark, soulless day in autumn, and the clouds hung oppressively low. As I rode on horseback through the dreary countryside that evening, I found myself approaching the house of Usher. Just one look at the house filled me with gloom. Sometimes even the most desolate and terrible sights have a kind of poetic beauty to them, but not that huge house on the evening I arrived. The bleak walls, the blank eye-like windows, and the few white trunks of decaying trees were depressing to behold. Still, I could not figure out what unnerved me. That totally unnerved me as I gazed at the mansion. If the scene had been slightly different, if the sun had been shining, for instance, it might have lost its sorrowful appearance. Nevertheless, this gloomy mansion was my destination after a journey of several weeks. Its owner, Roderick Usher, had been one of my closest boyhood friends, though many years had passed since our last meeting. I had recently received a letter from him that left me no choice but to go see him in person. The writer spoke of a severe bodily illness that coupled with a mental disorder that overwhelmed him. He wanted to see me, his best, and indeed only, personal friend. He hoped that the cheerfulness of my company might ease his suffering. It was the manner in which all of this was written, the heartfelt need that went with the request, that gave me no room for hesitation. I obeyed and went. As boys we had been close, yet I really knew little about my friend. He had always been shy and reserved, even with me. I knew, though, that his ancient family had always been noted for its works of charity and its support of great artists and musicians. I learned, too, that my friend was the last male heir of the House of Usher, the name commonly given to both the Usher mansion and the Usher family. The ride up to the House of Usher was, as I have said, both terrifying and depressing. Trying to shake off the dreamlike quality of that experience, I scanned the features of the building more carefully. The most obvious thing about it was its age. The discoloration had been great. Fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled webwork of leaves. Yet there were no signs that the house was falling apart. Each individual stone appeared to be crumbling, but the house itself was intact. There was, however, a barely noticeable zigzagging crack in the front of the house. It ran from the top of the building all the way down to the murky waters of the small mountain lake that sulked in front of the house. When I rode up to the mansion, a servant took my horse, and I remembered the Gothic archway of the hall. The butler of stealthy step led me in silence through many halls and intricate passages leading to his master's studio. Much that I noticed along the way heightened the vague feelings of dread that I have already described. The objects around me were familiar from my youth: carved wooden ceilings, somber tapestries, black wooden floors, and ancient armor. Nevertheless, these ordinary objects stirred dark, unfamiliar feelings in me. One of the staircases I met the family doctor. His face, I thought, wore an expression of low cunning. He greeted me with a wary sort of fear and passed on. The butler then drew open the door and led me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floors that they could, could not be reached from inside the room. Feeble gleams of reddish light made their way through the panes. There was enough light to see the biggest objects in the room, but the light struggled to reach the chamber's more remote corners. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The furniture was large, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but they failed to give any life to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. When I entered, Usher rose from a sofa on which he had been lying and greeted me with hearty warmth. At first, I thought that he was trying too hard to make up for his surroundings, but at a glance at his face convinced me that he was perfectly sincere. We sat down, and for some moments I gazed upon him with a feeling half pity, half of awe. Surely no man had ever changed so terribly and quickly as Roderick Usher. I had a great difficulty convincing myself that this pale, thin being before me was the companion of my early boyhood. Yet his face had always been a remarkable one. Usher had always had a pale complexion and large, luminous eyes. His mouth was thin and pale, yet quite beautiful, and his nose delicate and hooked, his chin finely molded, and his hair fine and web-like. It was hard to forget that face, but it had changed so much. All of his features were now much more exaggerated. The ghostly color of his skin and the miraculous luster of his eyes startled and even awed me. His hair had grown wild and now floated rather than fell across his face. Also, his manner now alternately lively and sullen. He spoke of an earnest desire to see me and of comfort he expected me to bring him. He talked for some time about the nature of his illness. His family had a long history of being extremely sensitive to all physical stimulation. He could eat only the mildest of foods and wear garments of only certain textures. The odors of all flowers were oppressive to him, and his eyes were tortured even by the faint light. There were only a few sounds, and those from stringed instruments, that did not inspire horror in him. He was a slave to this condition. I must suffer in this miserable folly, he said. I shall be lost. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident that may affect this intolerable agitation of my soul. I feel that the time will arrive sooner or later when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantom of fear. He was also deeply superstitious about his house, feeling that it somehow had a powerful hold on his spirit. For many years now he had never ventured outside of it. He admitted, however, that much of the gloom that afflicted him could be traced to a more natural cause. His tenderly beloved sister, Madeline, his sole companion and relative for many years, had long been racked by severe illness. Her death, he told me, with a bitterness that I will never forget, would leave me the last of the ancient race of Ushers. While he spoke, Lady Madeline passed through the distant part of the room. Without acknowledging my presence, she disappeared. I stared after her with Usher's astonished mixed with dread, though I found it impossible to account for such feelings. The Lady Madeline's disease had long baffled her doctors. She suffered from brief, intense seizures that gave her face a deathly appearance. The seizures were gradually draining her strength and making her apathetic. Just after I arrived, she gave way to the disease and became bedridden. I learned from her grief-stricken brother that the glimpse I'd had of her was the first day was probably the last I would see while she was living. For the next several days her name did not come up. During this time I tried hard to cheer up my melancholy friend. We painted and read together, or I listened, as if in a dream, to the wild improvised songs he played on his guitar. As we became close again, I saw the uselessness of my efforts. His mind radiated gloom. The master of the House of Usher had formed many strange opinions during his years as a recluse. For example, he believed that plants could think and feel. He thought that mere objects had the same powers. He even saw those qualities in the gray stones of his mansion. The evidence for such extraordinary claims, he said, lay in the terrible influences that had shaped his family's fate for centuries, leaving him as the sole heir. He blamed those stones for the awful state into which he had fallen. Such opinions need no comments, and I will make none. One day, Usher abruptly informed me that the Lady Madeline was dead. He also told me that he planned to keep her body for 2 weeks in the stone vault below the house. He wanted to do this rather than bury her right away in the family graveyard for two reasons. First, because her unnatural seizures looked very much like the signs of death. Second, because he did not completely trust her doctors. When I remembered the sinister face on the doctor I had met upon the staircase the day I arrived, I had no wish to oppose this decision. At Usher's request, I helped him make the arrangements for the temporary entombment. We two alone put the body in a coffin and carried it to the vault deep below the house. That vault had been unopened for so long that our torches half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere. That made the chamber difficult to investigate, but it was clearly small, damp, and dark. It was located at a great depth, directly, directly below the room in which I was sleeping. We sat down our mournful burden, we lifted the still unscrewed lids of the coffin and looked upon Madeline's face. I noticed the striking resemblance between brother and sister. Usher, now understanding my thoughts, murmured a few words about the deep intimacy between twins. Our glances, however, did not rest long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease that had entombed the lady in her youth had left a faint blush upon her face. It also left a suspicious lingering smile on the lips, which is so terrible in death. We shut the lid and screwed it down. We secured the vault's iron door, then made our way back upstairs into the scarcely less gloomy rooms of the house. Several days of bitter grief passed, and observable change came over my friend. His ordinary manner vanished, and his ordinary occupations were neglected and forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried and aimless sleep. His pale face took on, if possible, an even more ghastly color. His eyes were luminous no more. His voice quivered with as if in extreme terror. There were times when I thought that his agitated mind wanted to release some sort of oppressive secrets. At other times, though, he seemed to have simply gone mad. He would gaze into space for long hours, as if listening for an imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his terror infected me. I felt the wild influences of his fantastic superstitions creeping up on me, slowly, but certainly. I experienced the full power of such feelings after going to bed late one night. I had been It had been 7 or 8 days since we had placed the Lady Madeline within the vault. Sleep came not near my bed. Hours ticked on and on. I struggled to reason away the nervousness that gripped me. I tried to believe that much, if not all, of that what I felt was due to the influence of the gloomy furniture in the room. The dark and tattered draperies swayed fitfully in the breeze of a storm that was gathering outside. My efforts were fruitless. tremor gradually took over my body, and a demon of utter cautious, causeless alarm sat upon my heart. Shaking this off with a gasp and a struggle, I got up, and peering earnestly into the intense darkness of the chamber, I listened. Why I did this, I don't know. An instinctive spirit prompted me to do so. I listened to a certain low and indefinite sounds that came from where I know not. No pauses in the storm. Overpowered by an intense feeling of horror that I could not explain or endure, I threw on my clothes with haste. I planned to rouse myself from my pitiable condition by pacing rapidly to and fro through the room. I had taken but a few paces when a light step on the nearby staircase caught my attention. I recognized it as that of Roderick Usher. An instant afterward, he rapped gently at my door and entered carrying a lamp. His face was usual and deadly pale, but there was also a mad hilarity in his eyes, a retained hysteria in his face. I was appalled, but anything was preferable to the solitude that I had been suffering through before. Have you not seen it? He said abruptly, after staring about him for some moments. Have you not seen it? But wait, you shall. Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the windows and threw it open to the storm. The fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us off our feet. It was a wild yet sternly beautiful night. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force nearby, for there were frequent and violent changes in the wind's direction. The clouds hung dense and low enough to touch the mansion's roof, but that did not prevent us from noticing the lifelike way in which it careened into each other without passing into the distance. There were no flashes of lightning, yet on each cloud surface and on the objects around us there was an unnatural glow. You must not see this, I told Usher, as it led as I led him gently and firmly from the window to a seat. These appearances seem strange, but it's merely an electrical storm. Let's close the window. The air is chilling and dangerous for you. Look, here is one of your favorite novels. I will read, and you shall listen. In this way we shall pass the night together. I was half joking about the antique book that I picked up. It was a shallow adventure story that did little hold interest for my sensitive, troubled friend. It was the only book near at hand, however, so I opened it and began to read aloud, hoping that it might distract us both. Judging by the overstrained manner in which he appeared to listen to the story, I at first congratulated myself on my efforts. I had arrived at the part of the story where Ethelred, the hero, tries to peacefully enter the hut of the hermit. When that fails, the hero gains entrance by force. The passage reads, And Ethelred, who was valiant and mighty, waited no longer for the hermit, who was stubborn and cruel by nature. Ethelred, feeling the rain upon his shoulders and fearing the rising storm, made quick blows with his mace against the hermit's door. In this way, he cracked, ripped, and tore it open. The sound of the efforts echoed through the forest. As I finished reading the sentence, I was almost startled by a dull noise that sounded almost exactly like the one I had described. It seemed to be echoing from a distant part of the mansion. Just a coincidence, no doubt. After all, the storm outside was causing a jumble of noises throughout the house. I continued reading the story aloud. But the good champion Ethelred, now entering the door, was enraged and amazed to see no sign of the cruel hermit. Instead, he saw a huge scaly dragon with a fiery tongue. It guarded the palace of gold with the silver floor. Upon the wall there hung the shining brass shield with the motto, Who entereth hereon and conquered hath been. Who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win. And Ethelred lifted up his mace and struck the head of the dragon, which fell before him with a shriek so horrid and harsh and piercing that Ethelred had to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatsoever that in this instance I actually did hear a low, distant, harsh sound. It sounded like either screaming or grating. I could not tell which, but it was exactly like the sound described in the book. Started this second coincidence, I still had enough presence of mind to avoid exciting my companion. I was not certain that he had noticed the sounds, but his expression had certainly changed in the last few minutes. He sat in the chair beside me, so I could only partly see his features. I could see that his lips trembled as if he were murmuring soundlessly. His head dropped upon his chest, yet I knew that he was not asleep because his eyes were rigidly open and he rocked from side to side in a gentle, steady manner. Noticing this, I began reading from the book again, and now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, moved to claim the brazen shield. He hauled the dragon's carcass from out of the way and approached valiantly over to the silver pavement of the castle. As he approached the shield on the wall, it fell down at his feet upon the silver floor, setting off a great and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had fallen on the silver floor, I heard the hollow metallic clanging sound. Completely unnerved, I leapt from my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were fixed, staring before him at the room's door. Throughout his whole Throughout his whole face there reigned a stony stiffness. Yet as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, a strong shudder came over his whole body. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and he spoke in a low, hurried, gibbering murmur as if unconscious to my presence. Bending closely over him, I heard the hideous report of his words. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it, and have heard it. Long, 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 many minutes, many hours, many days. Have I heard it? Yet dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am. I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Did I not say that my senses were keen, and now tell you that I heard her first feeble moments in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, yet I dared not speak. Yet I, and now, tonight, Ethelred, ha ha, the breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield. I should have said, instead of the breaking of her coffin, the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the metal archway of the vault. Oh, where shall I fly? Will she not be here soon? Is she not hurrying to avenge herself on me for my haste? Have I not heard her footsteps on the stairs? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out the syllables as if he were giving up his soul. Madman, I tell you that she now stands outside the door. It seemed as if the superhuman energy of his speech had the power of spell. The huge antique doors to which he pointed now slowly opened. It was the work of the rushing, gusting wind, but outside those doors there did stand a tall, enshrouded figure of Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood in her white robes, evidence of the bitter struggle in every portion of her skeletal frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro outside the door. Then with a low, moaning cry, she fell heavily inward upon her brother. In her violent and final death agony, she dragged him to the floor a corpse, and the victim of the terrors he had expected. From that chamber and from that mansion I fled in terror. The storm was still abroad in all the wrath, and suddenly a wild light shot along the path. I turned to see where it had come from, since the mansion was the only thing behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting blood-red moon. It shone through the barely noticeable zigzag crack of the house that I mentioned before. While I watched, this opening rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind, and the moon's entire radiance burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls come crashing down. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and then the deep, dank mountain lake closed suddenly and silently over the last fragments of the house of Usher.